Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar hosted by the Investor Responsibility Research Institute and the Investment Integration Project on a new report, Central Bank and Development Finance Institution Approaches to Investing in Global Systems. Our agenda for today is as follows. We'll do logistics and introductions, an in-depth review of the research. The IRRC Institute will give its perspective on the research, and then we'll take your questions. In terms of logistics, all of the attendees are in listen-only mode, but we do encourage your questions. You can see on your control panel there's a question box. Throughout the presentation, feel free to type any questions that you have into the question box. Once we finish the presentation, we'll read those questions aloud and the speakers will respond. This session is being recorded and a replay will be available at www.IRRC Institute, where this PowerPoint presentation and the full report also are available. We encourage you to follow us on social media and put out information about this report. Our Twitter handles are @IRC Research and @TIIP_insights. If you have any audio or technical issues during the webinar, feel free to contact GoToWebinar at 1-800-263-6317. We have 3 speakers today, and the first speaker is William Burckart. He is the president and COO of TIIP and has been at the forefront of impact investing for years. He helped found 2 impact investing advisory firms and has contributed important research, including leading a multi-year effort focused on the financial services industry in collaboration with the Money Management Institute. He's also a visiting scholar at the U.S. Federal Reserve and serves on the Global Advisory Council of Cornerstone Capital Group. Our second speaker is Steve Lydenberg, and he's the founder and CEO of TIIP. He's also a partner with Strategic Vision of Domini Social Investments and previously a co-founder of Kinder, Lydenberg and Domini LLC, the originator of the Domini 400 Social Index, the first index that utilized social and environmental standards. He also was the founding director of the Initiative for Responsible Investment and has published a number of reports on responsible investment topics over his career. And then our third speaker will be John Lecumnick. He served as the executive director of the IRRC Institute since it was founded. And along with the board of directors, he's led the organization to become a leading source of objective research on an array of investment issues. He has decades of experience as an institutional investor, including time as the investment advisor to the New York City pension funds. John also is the author of the 2016 book, What They Do With Your Money, How the Financial System Fails Us and How to Fix It, published by Yale University Press. Just a few words on the IRRC Institute if you're not familiar with the organization. It's a nonprofit established in 2005, and basically what the Institute does is it funds and disseminates objective and unbiased research on a whole host of issues that are at the intersection of corporate responsibility and the informational needs of investors. We have a research competition, and that is underway right now. If you're interested, there's information on the website. There's 2 $10,000 awards, and the deadline for that submission is October 6th of this year. And we encourage you to visit the website, irrcinstitute.org, where this and 60 other research are available at no charge. And with that, I will turn it over to Bill, and he will tell you about TIIP and then dive into the research. Bill?
Thanks, Kelly. So let me start with just a really quick overview on TIIP. I'll start with the what we do and why. So TIIP helps institutional investors understand the implications of their investment practices and decisions on the environmental, societal, and financial systems within which they operate, and the impact of these systems on their portfolios. The reason this is important, the why, is because economic crises, ecosystems under stress, and societies in turmoil can disrupt investors' best laid plans and cost them dearly. As the world becomes increasingly interconnected, even seemingly local issues have a greater impact on these systems than ever before. Next slide. So next question is how? How does TIIP go about its work? So TIIP conducts research and analysis that enables institutional investors to make this important connection between their portfolio decisions and systems level considerations. TIIP's research portal and database of investor profiles, market analysis, and practical guidance provide a better way to match investors to like-minded peers, benchmark strategies, and otherwise optimize the development of investment activities and other initiatives that address pressing system-level issues. Next slide. Good example of this is this report that analyzes how and why central banks and development finance institutions incorporate environmental, societal, and financial system-level thinking into their activities. Next slide. The new report actually builds on our previous study, Tipping Points 2016, this is the cover of it, which examined how 28 asset owners and 22 asset managers are beginning to think about the impact of their investments and, in turn, how those investments are affected by global environmental, social, and financial systems. This new systems level thinking is additive to traditional investment scrutiny at the security and portfolio levels. One of the most important results of this profiling exercise has been TIIP's identification of 10 tools through which investors express this intentionality. These are the actual strategies that investors utilize to bridge the gap between what is happening within their portfolios and what occurs in the broader outside world. Next slide. So recent actions and statements by central banks and DFIs indicate that they are also incorporating systems level thinking into their work. They contend that concern for systems level issues aligns closely with central bank mandates to stabilize financial systems, catalyze entire economies, set monetary policy, and manage interest rates and money supply, and with DFI missions to generate economic growth and alleviate poverty through investing in the private sector and emerging markets. Key to this is the report identifies 5 on-ramp activities that these financial institutions use to address systems level risks and rewards, and it suggests parallels to how long-term investors attempt to manage systemic risks. The analysis suggests that investors can learn from how the central banks and development finance institutions approach systemic risk issues. Next slide. So the new study examines 6 central banks, including 2 US Federal Reserve System regional banks, 7 DFIs, and 1 microfinance bank, all of which are known to be incorporating environmental, societal, or financial systems level considerations into their programs. Next slide. Key finding number 1, there are 5 on-ramps to systems level investing. Institutional investors are increasingly entering a number of on-ramps that lead them to systems level considerations. Put another way, each represents a logical extension of the concept that investment has impact on the world at large, and that that impact can be managed for investment to fulfill its proper function in society, which should, in turn, improve efficiency and reduce risk as those systems affect investment in the future. In the 2016 analysis, these on-ramps, which you see here, took the shape of ESG integration, long-term value creation, impact investing, negative exclusionary screening, including reweighting, investment stewardship, and universal ownership. Next slide. And as I'll go on to explain, central banks and DFIs pursue on-ramps slightly differently. They include environmental and social risk assessment, engaging in long-term prosperity protection, impact measurement, financial system stewardship, and universal cooperation. Though different in many ways, these on-ramps are similar in intent to those used by institutional investors as they consider and manage their impacts on systems and consider those systems' impacts on their portfolios of projects and investments. Next slide. So let's start with the first on-ramp, environmental and social risk assessment. This is the identification, definition, and quantification of issues that are potential sources of economic instability, social unrest, or environmental disruption. The Bank of England, a good example, has determined that climate change is a risk factor similar to others affecting the financial or economic system, and has assessed its potential impact on the UK's insurance industry. It has also identified and embarked on defining the issue of stranded carbon assets. Institutional investors similarly integrate climate change related factors into their policies and practices, such as the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, which has adopted a wide range of policies and practices to address the challenges of climate change. These include integration of climate related factors into their investment risk assessments across asset classes, direct investments in alternative energy companies, sustainable agriculture and infrastructure projects, sponsorship of financial industry research on climate change scenarios, publication of white papers on the topic, and active engagement with specific corporations. So in either case, whether it's central banks and DFIs or traditional institutional investors. Both are traveling down similar on-ramps. Next slide. Yet again, here we have long-term prosperity protection. So this is focusing on the enduring long-term health of the systems within which they operate, which is vital to protecting long-term prosperity. So, good example, American Development Bank, with its current institutional strategy, which identifies social exclusion and inequality as one of the top 3 barriers to development in Latin America and the Caribbean. A good parallel with institutional investors who also consider the potential to create long-term value is the General Pension Investment Fund of Japan, the largest pension fund in the world, which considers itself a, and I quote, super long-term investor, and has made stewardship of its assets a primary focus, requiring its external managers to report on how they are incorporating issues such as climate change and diversity into the stewardship of the assets they manage for GPIF, and expressing the conviction that, and I quote, it makes sense for GPIF, a universal owner with a massive portfolio, to try and maximize long-term investment returns through minimizing negative externalities relating to environmental and social issues. Next slide. The third on-ramp, impact measurement. So this is specifying, evaluating, and reporting on social and environmental factors throughout the investment process along the dimensions of various impact evaluation frameworks. Good example here, Asian Development Bank, whose corporate results framework monitors and assesses progress at 4 levels, 2 of which focus on the organization's operational and organizational effectiveness, and 2 of which examine development progress in the regions where they focus and their contribution to that progress, aka their effectiveness. Good example of institutional investors that think about this, they're particularly in the impact investment space that make investments in companies, organizations, and funds with the intention to generate social and environmental impact alongside a financial return. A group like Threshold Group is a good example. Threshold has developed a number of tools to help their clients refine their impact goals and to measure outcomes associated with them. Examples of analytical tools central to Threshold's overall systems-related approach and aimed at assessing and measuring prospective and existing systems-related investment activities include a impact investment scoring system and an environmental impact assessment, which they partner on with TrueCost. Next slide. The fourth on-ramp is financial system stewardship. So this is protecting and enhancing financial systems over the long term by encouraging behavior that supports the prioritization by investors of positive systems level societal and environmental considerations in their decision making. So a couple illustrations here. So 3 central banks in particular, the Bank of England, the Dutch Central Bank DNB, and the People's Bank of China draw strong connections between their obligations to the stability in their national financial and economic systems and to environmental systems level considerations, focusing on climate change and sustainability. In point of fact, the DNB legal mandate was recently updated to include sustainability and states that it must focus on the sustainable prosperity of the Netherlands as part of promoting financial stability. Good kind of parallel to this with institutional investors is those that try to protect and enhance the value of clients' assets by engaging with companies, encouraging business and management practices that support sustainable financial performance over the long term, and applying ESG considerations to all investment activities. Good example, Aviva, the UK-based insurance and money management firm, which plays a leadership role in promoting public policy reform to promote advancement toward a sustainable world and set of financial markets. The chief executive officer of Aviva Group has been a leading advocate for stock market disclosure of ESG data as a listing requirement, and in September 2015, addressed the UN General Assembly on sustainable finance. Aviva's chief responsible investment officer is also a notable public advocate of the UN's SDGs as a guiding principle for public policy reform to promote a sustainable financial system. The final on-ramp I'll highlight is universal cooperation. So this is the consideration of the need for cooperation among nations that they serve in their policies and practices as they build consensus across regions, economies, and countries. Good example, Islamic Development Bank Group, which highlights among its successes maintaining neutrality on politically sensitive issues and among its challenges, the need for greater decentralization in its operations. Universal owners, i.e. those that own securities in a broad cross-section of the economy, are how traditional institutional investors also similarly travel on this on-ramp. A good example is CalPERS, the California Public Employees Retirement System pension fund, which considers itself a universal owner and has promoted the development of a number of data sources available to its peers. Its Sustainable Investment Research Initiative is a database of more than 700 scholarly studies related to sustainable investing. It co-founded the Human Capital Management Initiative, which developed tools for assessing corporations' human capital management practices, and it helped develop the Diverse Data Source database, which includes profiles of professionals for companies seeking diversity on their boards of directors. So I'm going to pause here and go to the next slide. I'm going to turn over the next big key finding discussion to my colleague, Steve. Steve, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Bill. And I'll turn our attention now to what TIIP calls these 10 tools of intentionality. They're the tools that institutional investors can use to explicitly incorporate systems level considerations into their practices. And they are the tools that we find also with the central banks and the development financial institutions. So next slide. So this is a graphic representing the 10 tools of intentionality that is derived first from the Tipping Point 2016 report. And these are the 10 ways we have identified and put our own particular name to that investors can use to enhance the resilience of the environmental and social and financial systems that are the ultimate source of their wealth creation. So given that central banks and DFIs' ability to fulfill their missions depends in large part on the maintaining of the health of these systems, these particular institutions have also been proactive in intentionally adopting these tools in ways that can provide leading-edge models for long-term institutional investors. And I apologize for the small print here. The report itself, in the report itself, you will see the more detail, the descriptions of each one of these tools. Next slide. So the major takeaways from this looking at these tools of intentionality are essentially two, one relating to the central banks and the other to the DFIs. So certain of these tools are particularly appropriate for use by central banks because of their close association with government and public policy and institution in the nations that they operate in. So broadly speaking, they can leverage their relationship with these policymakers. This is what we call the tool of polity, and their experience in conducting research, disseminating information, and convening industry peers. And these are what we call the tools of interconnectedness and self-organization. So that flows naturally from their position and mission. For the DFIs, it means that these tools, it means using these tools is a complement to their historical role, which is promoting economic development, particularly poverty alleviation and capacity building. This is what we call, as they build into organizations within these nations to do this, this is what's called interconnectedness. And in influencing and supporting individual enterprises and industry sectors within the nations, and that's what we call standard setting. And they also use these tools with their commitment specifically for the addressing historically underserved sectors of society, usually in the context of poverty alleviation, and we call that additionality, and to identifying and creating new and innovative approaches to development finance that solve basic social and environmental issues, and that's what we call solutions. So those were a number of the issues that you saw on the previous, a number of the tools that were identified in that previous graphic. So next slide. Let's turn to 4 examples of the application of particular tools, the definition and application of the tools. So the tool that we call additionality is the intentional strengthening of what are often neglected elements of the overarching systems. And these are the environmental systems, the social systems, and the financial systems. Through investment in key elements in these systems, particularly investments that would not have been made were it not for the financing of these organizations. For example, the IFC, along with other DFIs with a primary commitment to poverty alleviation, has explicitly focused on mobilizing investment in countries where capital is otherwise not available, and therefore contributing to additional resources to the world's most fragile countries. It also focused on fortifying these countries' underlying environmental, social, and financial systems through investments in infrastructure and financial markets. So this is the additional role that finance can play. So institutional investors also have increasingly been pursuing this strategy, such as the UK-based impact investing fund, Bridges Funds Management, which intentionally targets opportunities that create jobs, improve skills, promote healthcare in historically served communities, while emphasizing sustainable living, and has invested in companies that provide skills trainings for disadvantaged youth, energy services for low and moderate income communities, and programs that promote healthy lifestyles and obesity reduction. So parallel kind of approach that is being taken up under the aegis of the term additionality in both worlds. Next slide. This is the tool that we call solutions, and it is the intentional effort to create investment in vehicles that target and solve particular social and environmental problems with systemic importance. So the Central Bank of Kenya has used its commitment to supporting the development of a mobile telephone system within Kenya as part of its role as promoting a stable financial system. So it's actually taken the promotion of essentially a commercial enterprise as part of its role in supporting this, its role is supporting the overall financial system. So by contrast, there are a number of financial central banks that have, and development financial institutions that have used environment as a particular way, investments in the environment as a particular way of supporting the stable financial solutions and institutions. So the example there might be the European Investment Bank, which commits a minimum of 25% of its financing to climate-focused projects each year, including investments in what it calls high-impact climate adaptation and mitigation programs. And it's been a very strong promoter of the green bonds, what it calls climate awareness bonds, which it started in 2007, and through 2016 had raised over 15 billion euros from its its climate awareness bonds. Institutional investors have also taken up increasingly this solutions vocabulary. For example, the Dutch pension fund manager PGGM, one of its 6 core investment approaches is explicitly what it calls investing in solutions, for which it has targeted 4 areas. Climate change is one of them, water scarcity another, healthcare, and food security. So that's the solutions tool. Now, next slide. is what we call self-organization, and we've mentioned the Dutch central bank here. Self-organization is on the part of an investor, in this case a central bank, is allocating resources specifically to develop institutions that will facilitate the impact, their impact of systems level considerations that will help solve systems level issues. In the case of the DNB, this related to climate change, and it has founded and promoted two organizations within the Netherlands that are specifically aimed at drawing together institutions within that within the country across various sectors of the society that can help fund the transition, promote the transition to low carbon economy. So the platform, what it calls the Platform for Sustainable Finance, which it convenes, consists of Dutch banks, pension funds, insurance companies, and other stakeholders, and they develop cross-sector sustainability and climate change initiatives. And it also, that same platform is used to develop regulatory facilitations for sustainability finance. And in addition, the DNB supports something called the Sustainable Finance Lab, which is an interdisciplinary network of academics from different Dutch universities that identifies and recommends ways that the Dutch financial sector can, quote, contribute to an economy that serves humanity without depleting the environment. So some institutional investors also pursue this strategy. For example, in the United States, Trillium Asset Management, one of the longest, first of the pure play social investing firms, going back to the 1980s, played a leading role in founding organizations that have contributed to the development of a systems level organizations that can deal with these issues on systems level. It was the founder of the U.S. Social Investment Forum that became the model for other social investment forums around the world, and most significantly, under Trillium's leadership, it created the series principles in the late 1980s, which were the origin of the advocacy organization, the Environmental Advocacy Organization series, and the spin-off from that organization, the Global Reporting Initiative. So those are two efforts, one by the investment community and one by the coming more generally out of the DFIs and environment and central banks for what we call self-organization. And now a final example from the next slide, which is what we call interconnectedness. And this is this tool intentionally increases the information flows among peers relevant to this environmental and social systems level consideration. So this is really addressing the collective action problem, which is part of what getting to systems level considerations needs to contend with, and doing so through information flows. So, for example, the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco has authored a whole series of publications related to its healthy community initiatives. And it's been through this initiative and through these publications, it's promoting the idea that local economies can really only thrive when their residents are healthy, educated, and safe. And that includes the book that it published called Investing in What Works in America's Communities, Essays on People, Place, and Purpose. And it has also regularly published its Community Development Investment Review with issues devoted to such topics as health and community development. So institutional investors have pursued this strategy as well. So for example, we did mention before the CalPERS initiative on scholarly promoting scholarship in this area. So it promotes systems-related research, as does Norge Bank, as another example. It convenes researchers to discuss environmental, social, and governance issues, and has built and manages an online public database of 700 plus studies on sustainable investment. So those are 4 examples of what we call the tools of intentionality, which are particularly useful to the central banks and development financial institutions who are looking to understand and manage the financial stability issues that extend beyond the simple management of the elements of the financial system to the implications of the environmental system and social systems as well. So with that, I will turn it back over to Bill for the rest of the findings.
Thanks, Steve. And just as a reminder, everyone, as we head into the home stretch on the review of key findings, if any questions come up, feel free to submit them to the text box on the right-hand side of your screen in the chat window. Otherwise, let me just go take us to the home stretch on key finding number 3, which relates to impact monitoring and reporting. So although groups of investors have developed methods for assessing portfolio level impacts, particularly those from the impact investment community, and suggested ways to measure and report on progress at systems levels, institutional investors have generally yet to tackle these challenges on a broad or meaningful scale. In fact, few of the institutional investors profiled for Tipping Point's 2016 last fall indicated that they were focused on systems level impact measurement. Given that societal level impact is central to the missions of development finance institutions, we paid special attention to how they address the difficult task of measuring such impacts. Lessons that may prove useful to institutional investors have emerged from their use, the DFI use of managing for development results, the MFDR, and independent evaluations. Next slide. So over the past decade, a group of developing countries and multilateral development banks, including 6 of the 8 profile DFIs, have adopted the MFDR framework for systematically plan for, monitor, and evaluate development progress. The names and other specifics of each country and DFI MFDR strategy differ slightly, but all share the same fundamental purpose, goals, and general approach. So if you look at this chart, a central component of MFDR adopted by the profile DFIs is the results chain, which theorizes that various inputs and activities lead logically to higher orders of results. So guided by the chain framework, DFIs define their desired impact and outcomes, and those outputs, activities, and inputs that will ultimately help them achieve those results. So embedded in the MFDR is a commitment to transparency, and specifically to showing investors and other stakeholders that development financing is making a difference at a systems level as well as at a project level. In line with this commitment, DFIs that participate in MFDR release annual development effectiveness reviews that detail results and publicly disseminate information about their measurement methods. Next slide. So there are 2 kind of big key banner headlines to take away from this. The first is that the lessons from the MFDR framework may prove useful to institutional investors for assessing portfolio level impacts and ways to measure and report on progress at systems levels, essentially providing a blueprint for institutional investors to systematically plan for, monitor, and evaluate systems level progress. The second big one is that central banks and DFIs exhibit a far clearer focus than institutional investors on using the tools of intentionality in ways that complement their experience, strengths, and influence. Given that not every tool is applicable to every investor or relevant in every context, tighter alignment between the capacities of institutional investors and their use of the tools of intentionality could in fact lead to greater effectiveness in how investors ultimately affect systems level issues. So I'm now going to bring John to the conversation to give us the IRRC Institute perspective.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Steve, and thank you, Jessica, who's the 3rd author on this paper. And just a reminder, the full report is available at IRRCinstitute.org. TIIP.org, free of charge, as is everything we do. So last week I am an institutional investor by training. I wake up to not to give it a pitch over any other financial service, but it happens to have a radio station to Bloomberg Radio. It wakes me up in the morning, and I would say at least one morning a week, usually more. One of the news reports is on central banks, but it's always on what's the dot plot going to say? Where are they going to raise rates? Are they going to start shrinking their balance sheet in terms of the U.S., raise lower rates in terms of the European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, Bank of China, whatever? And we sort of forget why they do these things, right? As investors, we focus on the tools they use and not on the rationale. We focus on interest rates and credit availability, and in the case of development finance organizations, often on bilateral trade facilitation. But what's interesting is that the reason they're doing it is that they are trying to maintain financial stability, and they have come to the conclusion, from a policy point of view, that you can't do that without maintaining the health of the environmental, social, and financial systems. And so they have started looking programmatically at how do we do that. To me, that's interesting because, sort of by definition, central banks are central. And so while asset managers and asset owners are decentralized, there are thousands of us around the world. And yet, when you look at this report compared to the Tipping Points 2016 report, the Tipping Points 2016 report looked at all these individualized institutions and came to the conclusion that something is happening. We all have, on our own, reached the conclusion that we have to pay attention to system health. Central banks have reached that same conclusion, coming from a different place. And so understanding how these powerful institutions think about systemic risk becomes more important for us because they set the rules often. Steve mentioned standard setting, down to what reserve requirements are, or who can serve on the board of an asset management company in many jurisdictions, down to what level of risk management must you have, or capital capacity must you have. And so when we understand why they are thinking the way they're thinking, and understand how we are thinking in the same directionality, with the same sort of tools of intentionality applied slightly differently, it becomes very instructive for us. And so I definitely thank them for this report, because it's a part of the central bank and DFI mission and impact on the financial markets that sometimes gets lost amongst our myopia at looking at what are interest rates doing, is the Fed shrinking its balance sheet, and all of those immediate questions. Next slide, please, Kelly. They obviously, Steve and Bill went through a number of these tools. So I think not only the area that I was talking about, understanding why they do it, and understanding that we've reached the same conclusions, even if we reach them differently and have to implement them differently. But we can learn from some of the tools they have done, particularly in my mind, the impact measurement issues. Because they are trying to measure their programmatic impact, and for a number of institutional investors, we are trying to measure the impact of the investment side on non-investment. We all know how to measure performance and volatility and other natures of risk exposures. What we don't seem to be able to measure very well is outcomes across systems where we're investing. And so this right now, I know, is a very pertinent and hot topic. There are a lot of major international asset management firms and asset owners who are exploring this. How do we know that we are first doing no harm to these systems and second improving the systemic health? So I think looking at how the central banks do it might cut some of the development time off of the way we institutional investors do it, and might move not towards convergence in terms of doing the exact same thing, because they are in effect working on the programmatic side and we are working on the investing side, but certainly towards complementarity and the ability to speak, if not the same language, to at least have a translation mechanism between their impact measurements and our impact measurements. So again, I urge you all to download the report, and I will stop talking so that we can get right to questions. Thank you, Kelly.
Terrific. Thanks, gentlemen. Just to remind everyone, how the question and answer portion of the webinar will work. If you have questions, there's a question box on your control panel. Just type in the question and we'll read it out loud. One of the speakers will respond. So our first question is, given the unique nature of central banks and DFIs, what is the relevance of what they are doing for smaller and more traditional asset owners and managers?
Well, I think I tried to get to it, but let me deal with the smaller one. We believe, and I think TIIP believes, as in the tipping point report, that any portfolio investment has impact on the financial, environmental, and social systems. But even if that impact is too small to be measurable, certainly the impacts the other way of what the central banks and development institutions do has an effect on the market and the context in which you invest and the rules under which you invest. And so understanding these programs that they are undertaking, understanding what the goals of the programs are, can give you insight into the macroeconomic and regulatory context in which you're investing, and maybe some insight in the directions they're heading, particularly as these programs become more widespread and impactful.
Yeah. And just to add briefly to that, one of the things that's interesting about the central banks and the DFIs, they are very large institutions and they can do things on a scale. As small investors can't control interest rates. But what these examples show is certain kinds of tools that are applicable by investors who may be small as well as large. There is no reason why a small investor can't start considering the tools of intentionality and contributing to funding of historically underfunded populations. And certainly microfinance is a very good example of that. And what we see here is a question of tools that can ultimately accumulate into some kind of collective action. And to a certain extent, the central banks, such as the Central Bank of the Netherlands, convening, using its convening power to bring together smaller institutions throughout the country for collective action, for collective decision making on how to make a more sustainable financial system, is a way in which they also are creating ways for smaller investors and asset owners, asset managers to act collectively.
Thank you. Our next question, can you give us an example or two of how measurement of impact is being done?
Yes. So that's an extremely interesting question and leads to, I think, one of the sort of the next frontiers in this area, figuring out what kinds of measurements are out there and how they are applicable. So there are sort of two levels on which, and sort of distinguishing these, on which measurement is being conducted now. One is investors' measurements of what their actions in their investment portfolios, through their investment portfolios, what impacts those investments have had. And there are a number of ways of actually doing that. I recommend highly the impact measurement typology, which has been developed by Sonin Capital out of San Francisco. They have a nice half-hour webinar on it. They distinguish 5 different ways of measuring impact from a portfolio level. One of them is distinguishing stakeholders and business models impact. Another is relative impact versus peers. Another one is alignment with the SDGs and so the Sustainable Development Goals and so on. The second level on which impact measurement is being conducted is at systems levels, and the Sustainable Development Goals are the Millennium Development Goals actually, and the measurement of the progress that was made versus the various goals is a very good example of how that measurement has been undertaken. And the Sustainable Development Goals, for the 17 goals, they have almost 170 indicators of how one might measure progress to those goals. What's interesting about these two systems of measurement is that there's a kind of disjunction between them, and there are increasing efforts now to bridge that gap out of the impact world. The measurement impact coalition that has just recently talked about how collective impact can be achieved, and then there's a initiative underway among the Dutch to develop sort of transitional measurements between the portfolio and the systems. What would be indicators that would help you climb from one to the other? So a very interesting question, one that TIIP is definitely going to be struggling with, and we have a project underway now on that issue.
I would also just add to that, from the report in particular, particularly the central banks and DFIs, the DFIs and specifically are thinking about the measurement question. The MFDR process that I had mentioned, that has really helped to inform a lot of how, while some of them are generally following a kind of defined structure or process, they all are kind of putting unique spins on that fundamental structure. And so you have a DFI like the International Fund for Agricultural Development, which really builds their entire approach around 3 questions. What do we wish to achieve? What will we do to reach these results? And how will we know whether we have achieved them? And that really ends up helping to kind of ground and then guide the rest of their measurement process across the kind of impact evaluation chain that Steve may mention to. There's others like African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, and Inter-American Development Bank that really focus on assessing progress toward their strategic development goals along the results chain against 50 to 100 indicators divided into, I had mentioned these different levels. So development progress in their region of focus, their contribution to development progress in the region, project management efficiency and performance, and operational efficiency and performance. But there was, at least from what we saw in the particular analysis, that a lot of them are either adopting the kind of backbone of the MFDR approach and then emphasizing different components of it in different ways. And then even still more are doing more independent evaluations, homebrew type techniques. And we're seeing that, if you compare and contrast that against the Tipping Points 2016 analysis and the investors that we've examined since then, you find this kind of tension between folks looking at existing impact metrics and tools and kind of more systems level progress indicators and tools, and understanding that some of this is a one-to-one match, but a lot of it is not. And so there is a certain level of kind of bespoke homebrew quality to the way that a lot of these investors are ultimately measuring their impact. So I'll pause there.
Thank you. Our next question, we've got several in the queue. Do you have any examples of CB or DFI making focused efforts to disclose relevant ESG information beyond their usual sustainability reporting, including disclosure of information about financial institutions or clients that are recipients of DFI funding, or about financial institutions that are under bank supervision?
Seems like a very specific question.
Yeah, nothing comes to mind at the moment. Two of the central banks that we profiled were the banks of the regional banks of the Federal Reserve, and the emphasis on disclosure about health of communities, particularly what we mentioned about the Federal Bank of San Francisco, Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. It's not about the financial institutions, but it is about the health and stability of the local institutions, including financial institutions, presumably that provide help to the system.
Steve, if I can interrupt, I think one of the tools of intentionality is the interconnectedness, and where we've seen this is the Bank of England through the convening of the Task Force on Climate Disclosure. So the governor of the Bank of England is the person who commissioned the Task Force on Climate Disclosure, and that obviously, that's the Michael Bloomberg and Mary Shapiro report, which suggested that listing organizations, stock exchanges, ought to be requiring certain climate-related disclosures. And so I think this is one of those cases in which the Bank of England was supported by other central banks in this effort, manages to use their convening power and their interconnectedness with other financial institutions. So it's not that they themselves, in this case, have compelled disclosure, but they have convened a task force which is recommended disclosure. And at the last count that I heard, about 18 stock exchanges around the world had said they would consider that basically within the next 4 months. They said by the end of the year, whether they would go ahead and compel disclosure. So I think that's probably a good example of a central bank taking this issue, using its powers in an interconnected way to, in fact, compel that sort of disclosure.
Thank you. So the next question, do you have any examples of measurement of ESG risks beyond the traditional financial risk measures? You might take that one.
I want to know more about the question, whether it's a systemic risk measure or an individual corporate risk measure. Obviously, one of the proxy resolutions and ideas that has gotten the most traction in the last 2 years is a 2-degree strategic planning process for fossil fuels, and that's clearly designed to align strategy, risk, and climate disclosure in individual companies. It's not necessarily a system measurement.
I would also just jump in there to say, just at least from the actual study, a lot, I mean, I think to John's point, depending on how traditional ESG analysis, like what the person in question is referring to, particularly with the DFIs, in the area that we went deep on, they are segmenting out the different levels of impact measurement in a way that's slightly more sophisticated than a typical institutional investor embracing ESG considerations. And they're also thinking about it across kind of three different sets of perspectives. So both in terms of, say, output, so they're measuring kind of simple quantitative project-specific indicators. They're also looking at outcomes through various studies, participant evaluations, surveys. These indicators are, they could include effectiveness of a program at achieving specified objectives or likely sustainability of a program. And they're also looking at impacts with impact surveys supplemented with qualitative data analysis. Two examples that we specifically go a bit deeper on in the actual report include or a couple of them: African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, International Fund for Agriculture Development, and Islamic Development Bank Group. All of them we look at a little bit more in terms of the different levels of impact measurement that they engage in, as well as cutting across the spectrum of outputs, outcomes, and impacts, all of which collectively is, it goes far beyond the kind of traditional ESG risk analysis.
Thank you. One last question. What happens next? Will the IRRC or TIIP continue to examine the system level efforts of central banks and DFIs and other investors?
I think this is a good question in the sense that it helps place maybe this work in the context of other efforts underway that are looking at similar dimensions. So a lot of this work, and I would invite Steve to also reflect on this, a lot of this work we collaborated with Nick Robbins of the UNEP, who's focused on an initiative called the Financial System We Need, which has looked at central bank activities and their embrace of a lot of these kind of sustainability strategies and focus. And so I think for folks that are that continue to be interested in understanding the direction that central banks and development financial institutions, as they continue to embrace this focus and go deeper here, I think that's a body of work that they should keep track of. There's another initiative underway by the PRI Sustainable Financial System under the auspices of Nathan Fabian, that's looking at a lot of these kind of systems level levers that investors can pull to help achieve the kind of systems level change that we're talking about here. And then the task force just released new findings, and there's a whole host of activity. And then I think every day, whether it's TIIP or the GIN or PRI or others, are increasingly looking at institutional investor activity that is embracing a systems focus, primarily through institutional investors that are attempting to draw alignment with the SDGs, and in a more narrow sense, those that are actually achieving measurement of progress towards these goals. So I'll pause there. John or Steve, any other color you'd throw on that canvas?
Just to add that I think that this is a trend that's likely to continue. That is to say that we are living in a world that's increasingly complex and complicated and is dominated by interlocking systems. And I think part of the reason why all of this is happening now and coming to the fore now, and why it's likely to continue both at the level of the larger national, transnational organizations, as well as within the private markets, is because there is an intuitive understanding, if not explicit understanding, that these systems are, without these systems, the kinds of interrelated wealth creating mechanisms that we've created are not going to be able to continue to thrive.
Thank you. If we don't have any other further questions or comments, it looks like this concludes the webinar for today. The contact information for both John, Bill, and Steve are listed here on this PowerPoint. And as a reminder, this webinar has been recorded. We'll have that posted on the IRRC website by tomorrow at the latest, along with these PowerPoint slides. So we thank you so much for your attention and wish you well this afternoon. Thank you.